Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you all to this terrific event, the panel which was about to begin on art in the public today. So this is a series called Creative Process and Dialogue, and I think the first iteration of it was last year. And I think it dealt, if I remember correctly, with poetry and art, and we had a wonderful panel with the poet Elizabeth Alexander and Thelma Golden and Amy Sherald. And this year, we decided to focus on filmmaking and on the medium of filmmaking. And this is a program which we hope will happen every year. And I want to thank Drew Thompson for being the guiding light of it. And the idea is relatively simple, and that is to diversify and expand what we think about art and its public and its makers. And I'm proud to say that this is an institution, and many of you know, is central to its mission is the arts and its significance, which often is denigrated in this country or trivialized. And I'm very proud of the college's role in it, in all its programs, and it's an honor to have our distinguished guests here and to proceed with the panel. I want to thank many people who were involved, not only Drew, but the American Studies program and the Experimental Humanities program, our dean, Deirdre Dalbert, and the support staff of both the Division of Social Studies and of the Arts. And I really, this is what we're about, and I hope I have actually a rehearsal to go to, so doing is as much as talking. And so I want to, again, welcome you all and thank Tabitha, and without further ado, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening, everyone. Happy Black History Month. I can think of no better way to honor Black History Month than introducing the legendary filmmakers in our presence this evening. So I am happy to introduce Julie Dash, who is a filmmaker, director, author, and currently the Distinguished Professor of Documentary Filmmaking at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. Her journey began in Harlem before she went off to attend UCLA, where she created a film inspired by Alice Walker titled The Diary of an African Nun, which went on to win the Directors Guild of American Student Award. Since then, Dash has gone on to direct and produce over 17 films and television shows, including Daughters of the Dust, The Rosa Parks Story, and an episode of the drama Queen Sugar on the Oprah Winfrey Network. Dash is no stranger to the American hip-hop and R&B scene, having directed music videos for Peabo Bryson and Tony. At the 2019 Sundance Festival, it was announced that Dash would direct a biopic on Angela Davis with the support of Lionsgate. She is a recipient of numerous awards and honors, including the Sundance Film Excellence in Cinematography for Daughters of the Dust, an NAACP award, Black Reel Awards, amongst others. Please give it up for Julie Dash. Next, I am happy to introduce Charles Burnett, who is a director, writer, and cinematographer. Burnett attended UCLA with Ms. Dash, where he earned a Master's of Fine Arts in Filmmaking. In 1998, he received a MacArthur Fellowship, which is awarded to talented individuals who have shown extraordinary originality and dedication in their creative pursuits. With this fellowship, he was able to produce To Sleep with Anger, featuring Danny Glover, The film went on to win the 1991 Independent Spirits Award for Best Director and Best Screenplay for Burnett and Best Actor for Glover. To Sleep with Anger and Killer of Sheep went on to be inducted into the National Film Registry by selection of the Library of Congress. Burnett even has a day named after him by the mayor of Seattle in 1997 for February 20th, because what better month than Black History Month? Please give it up for Charles Burnett. And last but not least, I am happy to introduce Bradford Young, an award-winning cinematographer. Young attended Howard University, where he studied film. Since then, Young has gone on to win awards at the Sundance Film Festival for his cinematography in films such as Pariah, Ain't Them Body Saint, and Mother George. He also received several nominations for the film Arrival. Young has worked on many films and television shows, such as the Netflix documentary When They See Us, Solo, A Star Wars Story, and Selma. Mr. Young also inserts his practice of cinematography into the contemporary arts, having collaborated with Leslie Hewitt on United States Structures and Elisa Blount-Moorhead on a piece about race and healthcare in Philadelphia. Please give it up for Bradford Young. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by Professor Tabitha Ewing and Dario Vasquez, who are both Bard alumni. Professor Ewing is the chair of the Social Studies Department here at Bard, co-chair of the Columbia University Seminar Beyond France, fellow at the New York Institute for Humanities, and author of Rumor, Diplomacy, and War and Enlightenment Paris. Please give it up for Tabitha. Dario Vasquez, who is the co-founder and co-director of the Brothers at Bard program with Harry Johnson. Brothers at Bard is a mentorship group for youth in the Kingston and Hudson, New York school city districts. The organization, which recently received a $400,000 grant from the William R. Keenan Trust to expand their vision and initiative across the United States. Please give it up for Dario. Again, thank you everyone for attending this event tonight and for everyone who played a part in making this event possible, especially the event sponsors. I will now turn over the floor to Professor Ewing and Dario, who will explain the format for tonight's event.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you, Drew. Thank all the folks who participated in this, Christian and Maria. And my co-panelists. I just wanted to say a word about how this is going to work tonight. Dario and I are going to try to get things going by asking a couple of questions, which hopefully these artists don't find excessively academic and boring. Then we're going to leave it to them to actually be in dialogue with one another, which is really what this is about. And then at the end of that point, we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. So please, get your serious thinking going on. And you practitioners who are out there, you have this fabulous opportunity to talk to these folks about what it is that they do. Maybe to ask very specific questions about their work, or maybe even to talk a little bit about yours. So hold on to those questions, and we'll just get started.
So, I have the honor of asking the first question and kicking this off. One of the intentions of this public dialogue is to highlight the practices of Black filmmakers and the different forms of Black filmmaking that unfold within a university setting. We have seemingly opposite university settings and from two different generations represented on this panel. The LA Rebellion movement of the 70s and the 80s at UCLA, and the subsequent generation of Black filmmakers in the 90s at HBCUs like Howard University. Could each of you speak on your experiences navigating your respective academic settings as young Black filmmakers and students? And how did your experiences at UCLA or Howard impact your creative process and practices and influence your understanding of Black filmmaking as they unfold in university settings?
Okay, I'll start. Before I got to UCLA, I was in high school at the Studio Museum of Harlem, learning cinematography.
The best place in the world.
Yes. And then from there, I went to undergraduate school at CCNY in their film production. So I graduated with BA. And then from there, I went to AFI for 2 years in their conservatory program. So by the time I got to UCLA, to the graduate program, it was like sweet relief. Because AFI is something else. It's very, they're very intentional in what they want and what they want you to do and who they want you to become. And I just wanted to experiment with ideas that I had been carrying in my head for a long, long time, and I did not have the resources outside of the university system resources meaning the camera and equipment and the cranes and the dollies and all of those kinds of things. So UCLA was that for me. It had 3 sound stages, a tech center. It was like paradise. So how did I navigate through there? As I explained to some of the students earlier today, in the late 70s and early 80s, film wasn't really trending, So there wasn't a lot of competition for equipment there wasn't a lot of competition for the professors to look over my shoulder and really be interested in what I was doing, because it was such a long shot that I would ever go anywhere further than that. And I was able to function under the radar, so to speak. I always had Charlie or Billy Woodbury or some of the other students to look at my work and help me with it. But I was basically free to do whatever I wanted to do while I was at UCLA. And so, but I realize, I appreciate now that it's not like that in film schools. It's not like that at all.
No, sure. I was very fortunate to go to UCLA at the time, because it was a good time to be in film in a way, but at the same time it wasn't, because when I was in film, there wasn't very many people in color behind the cameras at all, and it was restricted. Like, for example, if you wanted to be a cameraman, you had to wait 15 years just to be a loader almost, because the unions were so strong, and if you didn't have a brother or some relative in the business, that was it, But the other thing that was really wonderful about UCLA is that they didn't tell you all of the negatives, That was up to you to find out. And so you weren't discouraged at all. You thought that you could do whatever you wanted, and UCLA sort of encouraged that. They meaning this faculty, students. The faculty would give you a camera in your project 1 and say, go out and make a film and come back with something we haven't seen before. And that was the criteria. And if you came back with something that was conventional or anything that looked like it was Hollywood, and even though it was seated in Hollywood, in Westwood, that you were highly criticized. You had to come up with something unique all the time, And so that was very, very, it was one of the best things that happened. And the other thing is the student body. UCLA had a great film department. It had a lot of great students in there who helped you. It was based on helping each other. And that's the only way we made films, by crewing on other folks' films. So you got to learn a lot, because you were in all these departments. You were a sound person on someone's film, you were a camera person on another person's film, you helped edit it, you helped build sets, and so you did everything. So you had this wide experience, of working on films. But you also had the encouragement of other film students who really were helpful. And one of the things that happened with us, particularly people of color, was that at the time I was there, you can count the people of color on one hand. It wasn't until later that a number of students, people of color, came in, and it formed this sort of mass of students that really changed the department in terms of making it more political and making this atmosphere where you talked about what you were supposed to be doing as a person of color, what kind of films you were supposed to be made, what you were making, and your obligations to the community. And And so it gave you a sense of the direction. And then particularly when L.S.L. Taylor, who was one of the first black teachers, came into UCLA, he instituted this program called Ethno-Communications Program that brought in, filmmakers like Sinbin Osman and other films in third world cinema, which dealt with political films, that all of a sudden, as people of color, we saw that these are the kind of films we're supposed to be making. It really was very helpful. And so I think, and also the fact that we were part of the civil rights movement, we were part of that, that was going on, so you felt as though you had to say something and do something that was going to make a change in society. And so that was one of the good things about UCLA. SC was a different ballgame when you went to SC. It was very structured and rigid. You couldn't do what you wanted, but at UCLA you were encouraged to make your film, So that was, a great experience being there at that time.
Bradford, you were in a very different context, both being at Howard and also a different context generationally. How did that influence your work at all?
Well, I think the one thing you got to understand about the Howard University Film Program is that basically it's a proxy of the UCLA Film Program. We are, it's forged, and the spirit of the program was propelled by a colleague of Julie and Charles. So Haile is part of that experience, and he brought that to Howard when he came. So when I think about that moment in UCLA radical filmmaking history, that canon of filmmakers, that was what our program was based on, being a continuum of that. So it's unlike, for instance, I was saying earlier to some of the students, there was always, and it's something I still wrestle with on a serious level, but there's always a deep-seated sense of inferiority, I think, amongst my colleagues at Howard when students from other majority cultural institutions, i.e. NYU or USC, who were at Howard would come back to Howard to show films. There was always a bit of anxiety for us at Howard because the work we were producing could not meet the technical acumen of the work kids at NYU and USC were producing. But we never really had that anxiety when folks from UCLA would come, because the aesthetic embodiment, the narrative embodiment, the spiritual embodiment, the social justice embodiment, the third world radical embodiment of the work that people from UCLA were bringing to the table, whether it be Disha, who was of my generation, when they came back to show their films, they were literally imprints of all the things that we had collected in our undergraduate experience and taken on to, for instance, Disha went to UCLA and she still is, and at that time was still miraculously the same kind of filmmaker, but better, but she still embodied that sort of LA rebellion spirit. I think the one thing that, I think the difference for me is, and this is something I'm still unpacking, but institutions are hostile environments anyway. They're hostile environments to art. So, you're always an island within a hostile nation-building project, right? Because academia has a certain mandate to produce a certain kind of working class, a certain sort of reverence to the system, so that can be brought back to the university. So when it comes to Howard and UCLA, they're both very colonized structures in that sense. So artists basically form their own island within those colonized structures. So I think the difference when you look at the Howard program versus the UCLA program is that, the UCLA program is a real war. It's a real war with a real known enemy. And so third world cinema played itself out differently in the sense that there was a radical mandate, whether it be written down or unspoken. It was a mandate that had to be agreed upon, which is what Mr. Burnett is talking about, which is what Julie's talking about. There was a spirit of understanding what you were against. I mean, of course, when Charles and Julie were there was so many things, existential things for black people that were happening outside of the campus that you knew your place. At Howard, it's a little bit more elusive. you take for granted that the power structure looks like you, and there's gains to that, and there are a lot of losses to that. And part of that is like it's most upsetting when the leadership is deeply colonized and deeply neo-colonialist, and you're trying to like be a radical thinking contingency within that, and get folks to understand that art is culture, and culture is a transformative force. So, you know, it's one thing to like have your story asserted and be supported in one environment, but still understand that the material that you're making is deeply colonized in its form, and you're looking for those who look like you to help you walk through that process, and you have that support, but you also know that the folks that actually run the institution are checked into something else. And I think when I think about the UCLA piece of it, there's more, to me, we romanticize it more because it's actually easier when your enemy is clearer, you know what I mean? And so that I think is the sort of, I know the difference for us. I mean, I think, and I'll just be very simple and just say, like, the other miraculous thing about Howard is that Howard is like, has no official cinematography program, but is still able to produce AJ, Malik, Ernest Dickerson, and many others who are cinematographers. And when we talk about somebody like AJ and Malik and Ernest, we're talking about some of the best cinematographers in the history of cinema. So the fact that there was no formal cinematography program, there's something in the water, I don't know what it is, but there's something strange about how, you know, that all came out of there.
That's dope. Thank you.
I think we'd all love to hear a little bit more about that as your conversation develops, sort of within these questions and outside of them. My question, I think, builds on some of the points that you made about the black aesthetic. And I suppose mine is really, is there a black aesthetic? Or are there black aesthetics? And to what extent does your work help to define that aesthetic? You know, what is it on the heels of? And, you know, I can't help but think, in the case of Ms. Dash, that Beyonce owes you a lot.
And so I owe her a lot as well, too.
And I'm thinking formally of time, composition, narrative, character, light, but also content, how you were able to make choices about who and what would be in your work.
Well, once again, at UCLA, we were pretty much left alone to do as we please. And it was there that I decided that in the writing, for instance, of Daughters of the Dust, which came after UCLA, I decided, okay, I am not going to write this as a formally structured narrative in the Greco-Roman way with the, you know, archetypes of Greco-Roman mythology. I'm going to use Orishas. And so that was one of the things. And that's, you know, clearly because of my studies with Professor Tashomi Gabrielle at UCLA, who taught films like, courses like film and social change. He taught Latin American cinema, he taught Asian cinema, and all these things that helped to build my confidence in knowing that why am I trying to bang my head against the wall and create these characters that are not coming from my own culture and aesthetic. And so let's try something different. And being, you know, a former UCLA student, I knew that the time was now to experiment, you know, to you know, basically tell the story that I wanted to tell, because I actually, the first draft of Daughters of the Dust was written when I was at the Film Conservatory at AFI. And even Illusions was written while I was at AFI. And of course, the writing instructors there, they were very formal, and they would say things, well, this is crazy, this is chaos, this makes no sense whatsoever. And it was like, thank you very much. And you still keep going. And it's because, you know, I was pursuing my own dream, my own voice, and my own mission statement that I had come up with at the time. And that my mission statement was simply I was going to be redefining how we saw African-American women on the screen in historical drama and contemporary diasporic situations. And I just stuck to that. So that's pretty much it. Yes, in fact, there is a black aesthetic, and that we were and we're still searching and embracing and creating that black aesthetic. It's changing. It's not something that's fixed, and it's fluid, and that's wonderful, you know. And yeah, there were arguments. There were a lot of arguments back there. Is there a black aesthetic or not? And it's just like, I believe so, because that's what we lean towards, and that's how we work, you know.
Well, yes. One of the things we did do, particularly when a number of black students came into the department, we had these meetings that lasted almost every night, way into the night. We talked about film. We made enemies. We made friends again. But we had this debate all the time: was what should we be doing, and what was a black film? Now we could point to a film saying, "Now this is a black film," and this isn't. But to define it, it was very, very difficult, and that's why we got in arguments and stopped talking to each other for a very long time. But it's true. I mean, we were just that passionate about what was a film, because you had, you know, these films that Hollywood had been making that perpetuated the stereotype, and everyone thought that this was a representation of who we are, and it was totally not. And you started with Birth of a Nation, of course, but then then the black exploitation film came out, and then we rejected those elements in it, and it was a black, you know, black directors, black content, and things like that. But was that a black film? And I mean, there was. I'll bring this up now because we were talking about it at one point. Like, Nothing But a Man is a questionable film. Like, what is that? And so what we did was we stayed away from it. You know, we never really wanted to address it because it became too controversial and you know, difficult. But we were always trying to find that thing that we can say. But what it was that it came to, like, I know what a black film looks like. I think I know what it looks like, but I would never argue with a person who says, no, this is a black film. You know, it's you know, we sort of left it up to the individual to some extent, on one hand, but yet still we kept insisting that there is an aesthetic, there is this, and so I'm still right now where I was in the '60s about it. So I mean, to me it's a question I don't have to answer, I don't have to deal with. I just know the films that I make, what they are, and so I don't know.
I think there's like a certain yeah. I mean, I think about it every day because that's like my job, my like duty as an image maker is to think about what it looks like, right? And so, but it's yeah. I mean, I think the way it looks is such an alive thing. It's actually it's like the most volatile bacteria, especially for Black people. It's like how can we harness? It's a difficult thing for me to harness. I think it's, you know, I often just blame it on my family. I just say, well, you know, my grandmother's in that shot, so that's super Black, so that's a Black, you know what I mean? So like, I think the one thing that like, what it looks like, I'm just gonna be a little bit more like pokey a little bit, but I think, because I have to bail out of the what it looks like conversation, because it's too ubiquitous, you know what I mean? It's very difficult. It's like if you go to Nigeria, you ask somebody who makes brocade for like the last 400 years, like, what is brocade? I mean, there's lace from Belgium in brocade. It's just like hard to quantify what's Black in it because the practice is so, it's formalized in such a difficult, layered way, right? So it's hard to, what I would say is, I think the one most important thing, which is what we learned from Julian, Charles, Hiley, Larry, Billy, that the cadre was that what it looks like could also be what does it look like. Like, for instance, if you're a child and you're looking at Black people make film versus if you're a child and you're looking at white people make film or majority cultural people make film, like what does that look like? And from a very existential place, like when I watch Black people make film, it's very different from the way that looks like when I see white people make film. And there's a certain harnessing of power and a certain harnessing of a very sort of soft but hard egalitarian thing that I see on the other side. And I think that's the struggle for me, is when we look at it as a process of making, like what it looks like is the difficult part. It's the reason why most people of color are not interested in making film or have a really hard time finding themselves on film sets, because the way in which film sets operate are very white supremacist. And that looks like a very particular thing. People are forced to move their bodies in a very particular way. There's a certain very hush-hush idea of the way things work. The power structure is different. The way people communicate to one another is different. Like, I work on those sets, like those big sets where I watch it all play out. But when I watch like oppressed people, struggling people, whether it be even when the process is totally colonized and it's trying to look like the majority master culture perspective, there's still something that weaves itself into the process that looks very different. And I'm not saying it's like less or more egalitarian. I'm just saying that there is a delicacy because of our relationship to power structure where the AD doesn't yell like the AD yells on majority cultural sets, and that people get checked all the time. You know what I mean? Like, people from the neighborhood walk on the set, we don't chase them off with the police. You know what I mean? We have other ways of operating. So I think the way it looks to me is like, I can't dive into like the strokes of light or why skin tone has to look this way. That's very, very, very difficult. And actually, I see where there's room for like some syncretism in that, but in the sense of like how people see the process. I think that like in the 21st century, for me, that's like a really big deal, because it's got to be less hostile. Because I know my son looking at one versus the other is just very different, because I'm an old person, not an old person, but I'm an old person in the mix, and I'm saying to myself, this is very different, because I'm experiencing them both and at the same time, but in very different ways.
I would love to follow up, but this.
You mentioned you called yourself an old person. So considering that we're at a college right now, and there's probably some aspiring filmmakers in the audience, film majors, what do you all hope to actually see from this generation of up-and-coming filmmakers? What kind of ceilings do they need to break? What kind of changes still need to be made in this industry? And like, what do you hope to see from them?
Well, I think the truth of the matter is every generation has their own task, their own voice, and it's not up to me to say you need to go over and make a film about this, that, and the other, and this is how it needs to feel, and this is the rhythm and the sensibilities of it, and this is what it makes it a Black aesthetic. Every generation has their own tasks as an artist, as an authentic artist, of what they need to do and what they need to accomplish. And I'm just an observer. Show me what you have. Show me what you got going on. Because I'm interested as a filmmaker. I'm interested in seeing what you're going to be talking about and what you're going to be showing me. So I'm here to listen, to learn, and to answer questions, and but not to really interfere with how they're going to do it. Their dance is different from mine.
I mean, we seem to have this pattern. She goes and I go, and so I don't want to break that.
Yeah.
No,
We can break it.
I'll since I got to my might as well go. No, I mean one of the things I hope for, and I hope filmmakers, even if they do comedy or whatever, that they're serious and there's something redeeming about whatever they do, because I came up in an environment where there were so many negative images. And I think as a person, as an artist, what all artists have to do is be responsible for what they put out there in society. You're welcome to do whatever, but at least have a balance where a young person can go and identify with the subject on the thing and not be embarrassed by it, and not or that it's going to have a negative effect, throughout whatever the person who's watching it, it's going to have. So I think as an artist, I mean, you can answer the question yourself. As an artist, what is your responsibility? I mean, look what we have now. I mean, look at what's going on in the country now. I mean, I mean, we have to, I mean, you people, younger ones, I mean, I guess, are going to have to address that and do something with it, you know, because, I mean, if you don't have responsible people out there saying no, you know, and this is unacceptable, you know, why bother? I'm not interested in people making films because they can make a lot of money off of it. I mean, it's good on one hand, but I think if you're going to make a film for like, what, $200 million or whatever it is, whatever it is, it's a lot of money, you know. And there's a lot of people who that money can go to, and organizations that can feed the poor and things like that. So I think you have a responsibility to judge and say, well, how important is this film? You know.
I mean, I think what I'm interested in is, I don't have anything to say like do this, but I'm interested. What it would be interesting to see is, I think this is from the most painful part of the process for me is the lack of loyalty, and the most painful thing I've had to like bear witness in my process of making film is the way we go to the table as a community, as a collective, and then parties get in between us. And there was a real interesting, there's this, don't go, but there's this crazy cinematography festival in Poland every year called Camera Image, and all the DPs get together and talk. And this year there was a whole question, like everybody's really on Netflix about what can Netflix do, because Netflix is seemingly more progressive than the rest of them. Amazon is tricking off money. Netflix is mandating diversity, inclusion. They're doing all the things, saying all the right stuff. They're trying to do the right thing, seemingly. And you know, there's a lot of questions about what can we do. And the thing that you can do is like, if 10 kids from Baltimore have a filmmaking collective, and that's a collective, that's also an industry, right? That's also the potential for, from a very working class perspective, the potential for people in the collective to fortify money to not only feed their families, but to make other material, right? Because film is such an expensive venture. If that filmmaker makes a film and that film goes to Sundance, don't crown the director, take the director away from the collective, and then break the collective. Like those are those old structures where they split us apart, take us away from one another. And because we love one another, we hail it as an achievement, but ultimately, at the end of the day, we still have to go back to Baltimore where there is no industry and it's quiet, and the leader of our collective, the person that generates the material that we solidify ourselves around, to create the industry, to create the jobs, to create the art that we're proud of, to create the body of work, the sense of self that we're proud of, they take that person away from us and they break us apart. Now, what's that got to do with young people? You don't own Netflix, you don't own Amazon, but I think, I was talking to some young folks earlier, it's like, they're very clear on who's got the cultural purse and why they need you. And that I'm interested in seeing how young folk organize themselves around that idea of self, and that you have everything that they need, and that it really is an open source world, right? I mean, we're getting hacked out of democracy, so these dudes making films, they're easy to hack. So if it's an open source world, let's figure out a way to like keep ourselves together, which is, I think for me is the seemingly missing, maybe it is there, and I'm excited and interested to see it, but not the singular dogmatic, but there is like a collective consciousness around how do we support one another. And I think I say that not because we've been great executors of that, but I actually, again, you know, you see the LA Rebellion for us is a very romantic moment. I know it wasn't perfect, but there was a sense of, there was a mandate that, you know, this is what happiness looks like. And Mr. Burnett was talking about that earlier. This is what happiness looks like, and this is what it takes. And I think part of what it takes is like we have to hold hands, and we have to, I'm anxious to see young people say, in order for us to move forward, if you want this that I have, then you have to take all of us. It's not gonna just be the one that you award, give the crown, and then that's over. I think that's a really, I mean, I would be excited to see that, you know? I mean, it's similar to what happened, I think there's part of it in the question, similar to what happened with, it didn't last, and that's sad, but it's similar to what happened with Black Audio, Sankofa, Cheto, and the British collectives, like that sense of, you know, you go work with John, you got to work with David now. You know what I mean? That was fortified out of those collectors, and they're very comfortable with one another, and I would hope that we can see that like duplicated.
This is amazing. Thank you, all so much. And I know we're probably pushing a little bit past time, but should I press forward with the fourth question, fearless leader? Okay. Okay, so my second question, the fourth question of the night. Artists sometimes achieve recognition for reasons that surprise them, for elements of their work that they may not view as their most important or innovative contributions to the field. Can you describe for us instances within your own work that you find particularly satisfying or misrecognized by your publics, mass public, film critics, funding agencies, and so forth? So a little something, and maybe here you could either be descriptive about past work or consider some of your upcoming work, your new work, and just, what surprises you about it when you look back on it, or when you think about this new work, like, wow, how did I end up doing this?
You could break up the order now. Yeah, you could break the order.
It's a very difficult question because, of course, a lot of times you make a film and it's misunderstood, but it's not so much from audiences that I have that problem with. It's from producers, people who have the money. I'm going to try to get financing for. They're trying to present this project, and they look at you like where are you from? I mean, it's like the reason why it's difficult is because you've been in situations where you think you have a good script, right? And you're made, particularly as a script of color, a person of color, you're made to have everything perfect, and then you hear about and read scripts from people who've been very successfully getting funding, and they don't even have a script, a whole script. I mean, scenes are missing, misspelled words, everything, and and it's like, well, wait a minute. There's one director, I won't mention his name, but I'll tell you about the script I read. He had pages missing, scenes missing. And what he would say about a description of a scene is that it's a great screen, an action-packed scene, and you go to the next scene. Okay? And so you look at your script, 125 pages, everything is there. You have it, proofread, and things like that. And so, but it's no really way of understanding why that is such, and so those are the kind of things that bothers me more than in the audiences. I can see where, that everyone looks at something different. They look at something differently, things like that. And so you can't please everyone. You just hope that at least enough people will appreciate what you do to keep you going, And if you do that, it's perfect, in a way. But it's when the problems I have again is when you take a project to a person, a script, or organization, and they should fund it. Because when I did To Sleep with Anger, for example, the people that I took it to, this organization, said, well, people don't want to understand it. It's not relevant or anything like that, and they wouldn't fund it. And so it's really, and young people people who started out need encouragement. They don't need to be stopped at the gate and says, your film is no good. And it's just ridiculous, this business. But anyway, I'm getting off on the wrong thing. But anyway, but it's those things that bother me more than anything. No, I'm joking.
Okay, well, let's see. Most people know me for making Daughters of the Dust. I love sci-fi. And so they're looking for me to do another Daughters of the Dust, or part 2 of what happened to the Pazant family, when that was just one iteration of something I had to say. And I think I've done, like I did Rosa Parks' story, Funny Valentines, and all different. I like to work in different genres. I don't like to stick to one genre, you know, because as a filmmaker, I'm exploring, I'm discovering myself. I'm playing with the technology and with ideas. But I think people expect me to continue on in that kind of like Earth Mother type of mode when I'm really more interested in other things. And some of the short films I've made for museums, like Standing at the Scratch Line or Brothers of the Borderland that I made for the Underground Railroad Freedom Center. But I feel certain times being confined to daughters. And so when people were saying, oh, did you notice the daughter scene is in Lemonade? I honestly had to say no until someone pointed them out to me, because I don't think about that. You know, I just saw Lemonade as being something wonderful, marvelous, and like, yo, you know, but I didn't see it until it was pointed out to me. So, yeah, I couldn't see it. Yeah.
I don't know. This is no. Go ahead. We're gonna say Charles.
No, I wasn't gonna say anything. Honestly.
I think. I'm gonna advocate. I'm gonna do an advocacy move for. Is he who's a cinematographer in here? Don't be scared. Raise your hand.
Yeah.
It's just good to know who's an image maker. I mean, I think there is, and this is not about anything else other than. Well, I think what I want to do is a little bit just demystify like how it all works. Like, I'm sure people have their ideas about how it works. For, like, say, I'm the cinematographer on the stage, so I'm sure people have an imagination or an idea about how it works for me. But I want to demystify it a little bit and just say that if I have any sort of I wish things would work differently in the sense that, number one, cinematographers image makers, we have something to say, right? We're not technocrats. We don't just show up and turn on the camera. I mean, that's very, very, very easy, right? That's very easy. And lighting is not easy. Lighting I think is more difficult than what people think it is. You have to tell a story. There has to be a story. You have to have your own story, and you have to understand what is the story on the page. And understanding what the story is on the page and where you fit into that story, that's like 50 years of shrink work. That's like a lot going on in like one film, right? The problem is that I think what happens is that we miss the mark because we don't think that the filmmaking process, as it responds, let's say, to a cinematographer, relationship between a director and cinematographer, it's a curatorial process, right? There are cinematographers out there that have a lot to say and they're very agile. But then there's some of us that are just not agile. Some of us are just very rigid. We do one thing, and it goes back to what Mr. Burnett said. It's like, I did it once and I made mistakes, so I gotta revisit it again, make more mistakes, learn from those mistakes, get better, revisit it again. And every film for me is an opportunity to revisit those mistakes. And it's very antithetical to the film process. Right, somebody hands you a script and you might like it. It might make you laugh. It made you laugh more than the 10 films you shot before, and everybody said that he doesn't do comedy, he only does drama. But if I see myself in the script, I'm down to like do it, but it's gonna be dark though, because that's what I'm expressing or I'm putting into the work, because that is something I'm unpacking in myself and my story. So I think the missed opportunity, or the things that in my experience that people missed were, or some directors that I work with that missed, was that it was never going to be that agile anyway, and that the process of the missed opportunity is the process of like sitting down and understanding clearly from the body of work what it is you can bring to that story that you're telling with them. We've cheapened the experience in the sense that as long as you like the credits, so they did. Actually, I'll just say it because I thought it was funny. I was watching Ad Astra, and I was watching the behind the scenes because I like behind the scenes. And James Gray, who I consider to be one of the great American filmmakers now, he was talking about why he hired Hoyt to shoot the film. And I thought he was going to go into a deeply metaphysical thing about Hoyt and time and space. And it was like, well, Hoyt shot Interstellar, so he can shoot Ad Astra. And I was like, really? That's what made, you know what I mean? Like, if that's the case, then there's some homies in Baltimore that are like insane who would have made Ad Astra light years visually better than what it was. I guess I'm saying when I think about that, those are missed opportunities where it's kind of like the process is so colonized, the process is so already determined, and those things that are difficult for us to unpack together on a human level, they actually, when we unpack them together, make the film better. And they're difficult, you know, they're difficult because you have to like tell your DP. I remember, I'm just gonna end it here, I remember Warren Beatty was talking about when he was working with Storaro on Reds, and how one day Storaro came in and just said, I'm quitting, I'm leaving the job, I can't do this, it's da-da-da-da-da. And then Warren Beatty had to say, man, just calm down. It's not always about you. You know, you're doing a good job, just calm down. And it's that thing that like, he brought Storaro to the table. He knew what Storaro could bring, but Storaro at that moment felt like he couldn't shine, he couldn't do his thing. And it just took Warren Beatty to say, you're doing it. You actually are doing it. I know you don't think you see it now, but I see it. You're doing your thing. And those things are very rare, and I think we should nurture and encourage those kinds of things.
This was fantastic. Speaking of colonizing, I cannot just continue to ask you all the questions that I want to ask, so I'm going to stop there, and I think we can open it up. Well, before we open up to the audience, maybe you guys want to ask some questions of each other, considering the distinctions in generational distinctions, place distinctions, changes in work, or even thinking about your future work. Anything you want to talk about?
I have a question.
Hands up.
Because I never get to do this. This is crazy. So for me, like I got introduced to third world cinema because I know you guys watched all this stuff together before I saw it. But like I got introduced to Hour of the Furnace, Jacko and the Holtra, Battle of Chile, all these films that were like, I don't even want to do narrative. I want to do documentary films. They had like a clear purpose. I remember one time reading this thing that Haile gave us where Che was given a speech and he literally enumerated all of the film projectors in Cuba that had bulbs that worked and didn't work. Like, so they were clear on why cinema had a place. Like it meant something to the transformation of that dream, the fulfillment of the dream they had to like make Cuba the place that they wanted it to be. So if you ask them why cinema, they had an answer. I mean, they had data. It was crazy. But like for us, like now, when you look at, because you guys have been through that experience where it meant so much, it clearly meant so much because the residue of it is, I always say Ava is like the dream. She's like the maximized dream of everything. Like when Ava goes and somebody says to her, who's her favorite filmmaker, she's not gonna say Spielberg. She's gonna say Charles Burnett, Julie Dash, Haile Garima, and that's mind-blowing. You know what I mean? That's like, the final frontier. We did it. You know what I mean? Like the dream that we thought would not happen. So like, but why film now? Like, what is it doing? We're living in this time. We're living in this moment, and we're in difficult times. You know what I mean? We're in difficult times, whether we know it or not. We're gonna feel it. We're gonna feel it real soon. It's soft right now, but it's gonna get hard real soon. And it's not gonna be about an election process. It's not gonna get rid of it because something else got sparked. And so now we need all the weapons, and I'm not a fighter like that. Like I got a camera, that's what I do. And I got my kids, you know what I mean? My wife is leading all of us, but like, why cinema, why film? What is it, what's its use now? What is it, how is it going, how is it useful?
I'm trying to think of who said it, was it Stalin? Who said it, that film was, at the time, film was the most powerful mechanism of the 20th century, and now it's both. It remains the most powerful mechanized media of the 21st century. One movie can change a culture. One movie can start and stop a war. It has power like that, power and purpose. And that's why I think it's been held by the colonized few, because of its power and its potential. That's why I'm glad that it's trending now, that there's so many young filmmakers out there working But at the same time, I didn't get a chance to say a while back that I came up on the tail end of the Black Arts movement. And for those of you who were out there who have read about it, who know about it, there was this like list called the 7 Principles of Khumba or something, that any piece of art that you created, it had the number 1, free the people, number 2, do this and that and the other. That didn't work for me, being in the Studio Museum of Harlem. Because I was very young, I was female. So everything I said, well, give me a camera, give me some film, I want to do this, I want to do that. They would say, like, why do you need to shoot in color? How does that free the people? You know, why do you want to do this? Why? And so I came up early on under this kind of being confined by the rigors of the tail end, the dying winds of what some people came up with in terms of how art should be, ought to be. And so that's why I say by the time I got to UCLA, I felt like it was paradise. I was free to explore, to play with what I loved, play with the technology, to play with ideas, and just to work. And I think that it's healthy to be able to do that for a while and not, come up under this, the constraints of someone else's ideas from 2 generations before yourself. So anyway, I'm just kind of babbling on, but I think that it's very powerful. I know that film is very powerful, and I know that more people have access to it now that it's gone digital. But I still think that people ought to, each generation, and you elder, what I call you, elderly millennials, need to, you need to have your own voice. You need to, do your own work, not our work, but do the work for the, humanity. But you can't speak in our voice because we came up under different circumstances.
Thank you. I can only give an example. I mean, I grew up with have these propaganda films, and they distorted, different cultures and nations and people and things like that. And I remember when I first saw films by Ozu, Kurosawa, and other people, and it's like all of a sudden I realized these are real people on the screen, not American interpretations, but real people to heart and soul, and I can identify with them, And that's what film does and should do, And I think it'll make the world a lot closer. So it's as simple as that, because when I tell this story, when I screened my film, Sleep with Anger, it was in Hawaii of all places. And after the screening, this lady raised her hand and said, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure." She said, "I didn't know black people had washing machines." And I'm like, but I mean, she was, but she was sincere, and she never experienced a film that showed black people, anyone else other than white people, had these things in their house. We were all like poor and with no shoes and whatever it is and so forth. But she never understood or saw people in a different light or a different way than what Hollywood had portrayed. And so I think for us, and the same thing with other films. When I saw African films, about Ozaman Sembène and all these other folks, whether it's Hispanic or Chilean or whatever, I mean, it opened the world to me. And I can no longer look at talking about fake news and all this other stuff and propaganda about people. I knew that people were just like myself out there. And so I had to really look around and say, I've been robbed, And I told a person this the other day, and this has a lot to do with what we're talking about. When I was in junior high school or some level of school, I remember my art teacher saying that Egyptians cannot paint. They only draw flat figures, Okay, so I was brainwashed by that, And so I always sort of sadly enough, believed in that. And then when I went to Egypt, went to Luxor, Karnak, and places like that in the Valley of the Kings, it was a mind, I mean, I was with a producer, and we were there together, and he said, space people did this. He couldn't imagine people had that kind of technology, and people of color had that technology. But it was, and when I saw the art that was produced, it was this false, why, you know, it sort of came, why did people lie? And so I think exposure would correct a lot of things. There are a lot of people who don't get outside of the ghetto, outside of Beverly Hills or Westwood, you know, would understand. Look, there are people who had civilizations long before New York, you know, was all these sorts of things. So I think film has a tendency, or should, I mean, to educate people and inform people, you know. And so, I mean, that's what I look at basically what film does, or any art form, you know. So I don't know how I got on that, but anyway, that's my thing.
Should we open it up to questions?
It's your show.
It's my show. Let's open it up to questions. I think we're going to have a couple of mics on both aisles. Is there someone else who's going to?
Thank you so much. I was wondering about the sort of influences and dialogues that you have, like Black American filmmakers were having with Black British filmmakers. Thinking of Stuart Hall or Horace Hove or Lionel Nakagane, Jonah Comfra, the collectives that happened, because there's kind of a talk about the opposition to power structures and colonialism that is perhaps similar to the United States. So I wonder if, I know that Jonah Comfort, for example, taught at NYU and other places, but in the US, but how were the dialogues between UCLA and other schools in the UK?
We know John and Lena and the people at Cheto and Sankofa in the UK and what's his name? Who did Langston? Isaac Julian. We shared time with them. We had long discussions with them. We visited them in England. They came to visit us. Sometimes Isaac and his partner came and stayed with me in LA. So we were all very close back in the 80s and 90s. And then everyone kind of like went their separate ways. But yeah, we learned a lot from them. They were very theoretical, you know, in their pursuit of filmmaking. And what, maybe we were less, but we shared ideas. I could say that, yeah.
No, I just, oh, excuse me. I just remember that, I mean, that we, I think it was the Black independent films really had an impact on Sankofa and Isaac Julian, all these people, and I can't think of the person's name at the moment. He did Burning of Illusion. Yeah, Menelik Shabazz was a very funny guy. It's a different story, but no, he was great. No, we encouraged one another. You know, we informed, and there was like Parminder Ver. I don't know if you know Parminder Ver, who was like a centerpiece there, who sort of helped get finance and stuff like that, and helped to promote films there. Yeah, June Giovanni, who's still active in a way. And so it was really refreshing because there was all these organizations throughout in Paris the same way. We had relationships with filmmakers there. And so it was like this movement that was, you know, they had the French wave, the Italian films, and we sort of had a similar situation with Yeah.
Ed Hondo, and
Yeah, so, so it looked like it was going to be a more of an established relationship. But like anything else, when the money ran out in Channel 4, that they sort of like doop, went down. And so it was, you know, I think looking back on all these situations, like the LA Rebellion and also the British Film Initiative and getting, you know, these films off the ground, that we should have did more. We should have made sure these institutions not only exist but were permanent. And there's a lot of reasons why it didn't, but I think that was the problem that we didn't see coming, that we should have seen, because we thought that they thought, one of the criticisms I heard from some other folks said that we thought the money wasn't going to run out, and they should have realized that Channel 4 was limited in what they were going to do with these organizations that they were funding.
Right, and AJ did a lot of work with John Comfort. He shot quite a few films for him.
I just shot something for John, and you know, it's like I was waiting my whole life for that. You know, obviously other than shooting something for them, but like that was a big moment for me. But I mean, I think the takeaway is, again, you know, it's funny enough, we're like a generation later, and we still all really reflect on those movements because they were the collectives, because they were so powerful, and that was part of our learning. I mean, the thing about it is, you know, you got to understand too that the symmetry between that movement and that movement, this moment, that moment, that collective nature of making filmmaking came out, for instance, in England. It came out of, the real story is that black people and Sikh kids and Southeast Asian kids were burning London down, and they realized that in order to keep those cats from hitting the streets and burning London down, they needed to give them outlets. I mean, actually, in Hansworth's song, John really like highlights, I mean, he highlights the beginning of drum and bass. You see the Tabla Club kids getting together with the sound system kids, and they come together, and 15 years later, 20 years later, the Asian Dub Foundation comes, or Josh Aka Sound. Is like, there's many of these tracing many things, but the financial commitment to that was, don't burn the empire. So take this money and make it. And that's, you know, that's kind of what I was trying to get at earlier about collectives, this idea of collective, like, how are we sourcing them? Who's giving us the money? When they decide that all is quiet and the masses have hush-hushed and they take the money away from you, do we fall apart or do we stay together? I think that's the interesting thing about that tale. I mean, you know, clearly John is like, John and Isaac are the most prolific out of all of them. Actually, Alwyn Kutchler and some other DPs came out of that movement. Alwyn, who was married to Ngozi, and now Alwyn is a humongous DP. You know, he shoots everything. Steve Jobs, he shot Ratcatcher, he shot so many films. So many people came out of that, but the collective didn't last because the money was not, as you said, when Channel 4, and there's other things too, cultural things, other things too, you don't get along with people, if it doesn't work anymore, of course you shouldn't keep it together if it doesn't work. It's like like a bad marriage, if it doesn't work, just let it be what it is. But that particular, the way it was fueled, was already volatile. You know, if I had an analysis as a young person, if you would allow me to have one, it was like, and that inability to sort of keep it as a sustainable working model that you could then go back to finance your own thing without asking Channel 4, without asking the Fonsus of the world to like finance your films. It was like I think the missing link. That's the thing we should learn from it, you know. It's like, how do we take our $10 and keep it going? Or how do we, my wife's Haitian, right? In Haiti they got the susu, right? So the susu is, everybody puts in the pot. You know how much tuition gets paid off for that? You know how many houses, how many car notes get paid? How many, nobody goes hungry? It's so interesting how that collectivized money economic situation works, and it's something that I think filmmakers could learn from.
As black filmmakers and cinematographers in your time, how and when would you say you got that big break where you were able to have a national, international influence on the world?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that? Because I can't hear very well.
I said, as black filmmakers and cinematographers, when and how would you say you got that big break where you were then able to make an impact both nationally and internationally?
I'd like to sort of say something one of the things that was very important in the rise of black independent film was the fact that you had people like Catherine Ruel, Ulrich Gregor, Art Hisselink, and some other folks throughout Europe, yeah, who put on programs of black independent films. And they scoured the U.S., looked all over the U.S., and it was a thing of timing because we had started producing films or making films at these different schools, and so there was a body of film there. And there were people like Oliver Franklin, I mentioned earlier, Pearl Bowser, and people like that who were putting together packages of films to be shown here in the States. But what was important was these programmers looked for these films and put them in the major film festivals and houses there. And whereas they didn't do it here, not that but the festivals here weren't interested. They didn't even talk about black independent films. In fact, it was Bill Gunn and Gunja Hess, who made Gunja Hess, was really a phenomenal success in Paris. And he said the French journalists followed him to the door of the airplane. It was all this crowd, massive people cheering him on and on. He said when he got to the States, it was dead silence, And that happened to a lot of us. But the fact of the matter is there were these organizations that took these films and wrote about them in the major newspapers. In magazines, it was like, it was really a phenomenal thing because they talked about these films in terms of they were art, which was kind of like unlike what was going on here, and because Channel 4 was there and ZDF, ADR, whatever it is in Germany, all these other organizations, we looked at these films and funded, produced other films. And I think that was a lot of money and a lot of production came out of that exposure in Europe. And that really was an important factor in black independent film development in the States, I think.
Hi, it's Lamar again. Just wanted to see, can you give me a snapshot
Sit
of...
up, brother. Sit up. I can't see you. There you go.
Can you give me...
Hard.
All right, so can you give me a snapshot of your childhood and how that affected your early works and how that has evolved into your current and future projects?
Snapshot. Okay. I grew up in New York City in the Queensbridge projects. Very much of an introverted child. I was always imagining things and making up stories. Had no idea, of course, that I was going to become a filmmaker. Even when I stumbled into the Studio Museum of Harlem with my best friend, we were there for 2 weeks before we realized that it was not still photography, it was cinematography we were studying. So we had fun there, and then we saw great films. I don't know if, I do know. I think it helped for me being a very quiet child with a big imagination who, I actually once had a blog called Smuggling Daydreams into Reality. I was daydreaming all the time, but at the time I did not know I was going to eventually become a writer and a filmmaker. But I think all of that came together in a cohesive manner once I stumbled into the Studio Museum of Harlem and was able to see my first black and white silent film with subtitles, a Russian film, and after sitting there protesting about having to read subtitles, it all just came together, and I became, a foreign film aficionado. I, love Russian films and French films and what have you, and the films of Satyajit Ray, Indian films, because, Ozu's films, because there was something, like Charles said, there was something so familiar about them, even though they were foreign. They were just as familiar as the people I knew back in Queensbridge in the projects than ever, and they were more familiar than the people I saw on television. even the black situation comedies, the people in the Saget Ray's films were more familiar. And that's what sealed the deal for me. I wanted to learn how to reimagine the life that I knew inside of the frame.
You want me to follow, right? Okay. Okay, I can try to give you a snapshot. I can only assume that I was an average person, kid, growing up in South Central, in a way. LA was really an unusual place because a lot of it was undeveloped then, and so there was a lot of vacant areas and fields and things, swamps, believe it or not. And as kids, we were like all over the place. I mean, your parents would go to work in the morning, whatever it is, and you were left on your own throughout the day, basically, particularly in summer. So you were like building rafts in these swampy areas, things like that. So it was sort of idyllic kind of a situation where, and we had BB guns and arrows and went hunting, and so we thought we were, things like that, and risking your life and doing, we did a lot of dumb, stupid stuff and managed to survive, But I'm from Mississippi, but I grew up in LA. The people in LA, where I live, were basically from the South, and I mean, it was like, you had everything in LA. Didn't have the mosquitoes as such, but you had everything else. You had racism, you had everything. LA was divided. You had areas you couldn't go. It was part of it was like a sundowner town, like Inglewood, you couldn't go there at a certain hour, whatever it is, and you had to be back. And even Beverly Hills was like that. All those places. So it was. On one hand, there was this notion that it was very liberal and had all these things that were progressive, but in reality, it was, all the police were from the South. Chief Parker hired Southern police to deal with the black population and things like that. But we had, it was, I mean, for a kid growing up, everyone had oranges or fruit trees and things in the backyard, so we would always jump over a neighbor's yard and take every apricot he had and so forth, and so it was a great place. We had chickens and dogs and turkeys and all that kind of stuff, and my brother had a horse and stuff, and so it was a great place. We didn't we didn't understand that we were didn't have advantages as other folks. In certain ways we did and didn't. It wasn't until I was in junior high school, elementary school, the teacher had on the board, it said, rich, middle class, and poor, So all the students said, well, we're in the middle class, And the teacher said, no, you're poor, And so, I mean, we had all these realizations, come about. But the thing was, it was a rich neighborhood, because the parents, and this is one of the things that bothered me about films, we had parents, mother and fathers that worked, and I always admired these hardworking men, and I used to do this work in summer with my friend. It was a carpenter and build houses and masonry and stuff like that, and these guys would go and work on these mixers. They put sand and these mixing things and these mixing machines to create concrete and all this sort of thing, and plaster. And so in the summer, I would try to do that, but I was really lightweight, and not really, And these guys had veins like this cable right here, things like that. And I always look up and admire it, but I couldn't do that kind of work. But anyway, so I would try to do that and all sorts of other things. But most of the people were, like I mentioned earlier, were from the South. We were from the South, and so they would get a bottle of Granddad, whiskey, very strong whiskey, and come home from working on these mixers and cement things, and would drink that and may or may not eat, but if they did, it was this, high calorie food and stuff like that, dying, later on have an effect. But they would tell stories, and because most people were from the South, and it was this really interesting time where you can sit down and listen to people tell these these stories about themselves, about the community, about things, and things that weren't very pleasant, and so forth, but it sort of created this world that I was always interested in, and so I think it was that was where I became not so much interested in film, but in storytelling through being in this environment where folklore and storytelling was, and I think the thing that made me really interested in telling folklore is I remember I was with these older men standing around. I was very small, and this guy was telling me this story. I won't mention it here, but anyway, it was telling me this story, and my mother came out and said, "Don't tell that boy that story," because it was a sort of X-rated kind of a story. But being small, I didn't know what the meaning was until years later, and things like that, So, but it always made me wonder about, well, what was that? What was I missing, And so, anyway, so like I said, most of the kids grew up were from the South, so it was this really exciting thing, So I don't know, but most of the kids, you have this prison initiative thing, right? So a lot of the kids I grew up with, they all had this rite of passage by going to juvenile hall or prison, Just about that was a way to you'd go there and you'd get big and all that kind of stuff. You don't want to beat up everybody when you got out, And so it was that kind of a strange period, but it was fun. So anyway, that was my bringing up. Yeah.
Well, I'm from. No, I'm sorry. I was just gonna say I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. I was born in Louisville. I left Louisville when I was 15. My father's from Chicago, so I spent most of my life between Chicago and Louisville, but mostly in Louisville. And I come from a very old Black aristocratic family in town. We have a family business. My people are morticians, so we bury the dead. So I spent 99.9% of my time in the funeral home, and that's where I grew up. That's where I worked. I got my first job when I was 11, doing whatever my uncle asked me to do, which meant helping him embalm, waiting at funerals. I would do stuff like I was saying earlier, take that little ruler and measure the 3 inches between each chair in a chapel and sit back at the chapel door and look at the chairs and make sure everything was balanced. Everything looked like a Wes Anderson frame. But I grew up on the west side of town, you know what I mean? I didn't know any white people at all, really. And my grandfather kept it that way. But my grandfather was a very interesting cat. He was chairman of the board at University of Louisville. He was superintendent of schools. I saw a lot of things that didn't make sense to me when I was a kid because, we'd be at the University of Louisville basketball games and some old dude from what I know now is the syndicate, the cats that basically financed Muhammad Ali's career early on, they would come and shake my grandfather's hand and he would do that thing, But if it was if it was a brother, he would get up, and I would be like, why are you standing for the white dude? Why are you only shaking the brother's hand? There was all these indicators. There were a lot of things happening and a lot of things playing out. But that was a very different situation when I went to Chicago. My grandparents were in Chicago were more austere. My grandmother was deeply religious and she had a lot of grandkids. It wasn't just the grandkids from her kids. It wasn't the kids of her kids. It was also the kids in the neighborhood and the kids in the church. And my grandfather was a preacher and a cook. And my grandmother put decals on speedometers of cars, you know what I mean? And my grandfather was very loving, and we would pull in from Louisville, Kentucky at 5 o'clock in the morning, and he would have 5 bags of White Castles and a bunch of Captain Crunch waiting for us. And a lot of hugs and a lot of kisses, And my grandmother wasn't that. She was very religious. And my mom's parents my grandmother was deeply loving. And my grandfather was deeply loving, but he was deeply stern, And I grew up in a house that my grandfather built for his family, but my grandparents didn't live in that neighborhood anymore. They lived in the Cherokee Park area, which was more affluent, and they had some money, so they moved there. And I spent my days on the west side of Kentucky chasing what we call river dogs, which are basically dogs that hang out down by the river, and we go down there and throw rocks at them and get them to chase us. And, you know, we're from Louisville, so there's always tornadoes, so we never went to the basement. We just ran outside and see if we could hop in the tornado. We were just crazy. And, but there were rules, you know what I'm saying? There were rules to abide by. For instance, you know, we were at home, you know, we could play outside, we played rough and tumble and have fun, but when we were at home, it was a sense of organization, you know, and my grandparents didn't play. They had us on a tight leash, and that we had to respect their house, and we had to respect, which was the most important thing in the house, is that you had to respect the art, and you had to respect the art on the walls, and you had to pay attention to what my grandmother was telling you when she was telling you about the Jacob Lawrence on her wall, or the time that, you know, for instance, in Louisville, you know, when Miles or Clifford Brown or whoever came to town, they had to get hosted by family, you know what I mean? So they would get hosted by my grandparents. So there was always like that thing in the background. Again, when I was younger, I was like, where's Eric B. and Rakim? But they were like, don't worry about that. We're talking about Clifford Brown right now. Do you know that man played his trumpet? You know what I mean? Like, it was always those kinds of stories that you didn't check into. But now when you get older, you remember. So it was that kind of like pastiche of like Black life, which is the reason why I love Charles's film so much, because they speak to my experience, which was like, I have 4 or 5 different realities, 2 realities in one place and 2 realities in another place. And that when I went to Chicago, all my cousins in Chicago they picked on us because we put up in a different kind of car. You know what I mean? They made us feel bad, but we loved them. But that was their way of letting us know that, excuse my language, you ain't shit in Chicago. You country up here, and you better watch what you say and stick close. You know what I mean? When we went home, my grandfather was like, Emmett Till was real for him. You know what I mean? It stuck in his heart, and he made us aware that we needed to be careful and that we needed to, what he used to say, keep our nose clean and stay in our place, and that's what we did. He used to say something really interesting that's funny. He used to say, you can't be white yet. And that was like, depending on where you were in your age, you either like ran out the room repulsed and would bring a book back and tell them to read a book, or you were like, yeah, I hear you, you know? So it was that kind of environment. But back to I say all that to say that like all the films that I grew up on, the Goonies and the Star Wars, and they were very seductive, and they had a quality to it. But once I knew better, I realized that those films didn't do anything for me. They were like literally donuts. I ate them, but they provided me with no nourishment. The films that provided me with the nourishment, because they were a reflection of my life, are the films that Julie and Charles were making, because they embodied all the mythology, all the dust and dirt kicked up in the air and backlit in Killer of Sheep, or my uncle embalming bodies, putting paper towel in people's heads, rebuilding people I knew, you know what I'm saying, the cousins of people I knew, like watching him do masterful artwork. He was a sculpture artist, looked like brothers slaughtering cows in Killer Sheep, or going to Humphreys, Arkansas with my family from Chicago and like seeing things like bottles on trees and not knowing what that was about, or, you know what I mean, watching my uncle Stoney, who was named after Stonewall Jackson, crazy, handling mules, like they were in those films, so it just all made sense to me. And I think the funeral home was a very visual, aesthetic place because it required a certain organization, it required a certain smell, it required a certain regiment around aesthetics and seeing your people pass on. And when I trace my love for aesthetics and images and those things, I know it started there. It started with all that, like the light during a tornado in Louisville is incredible because the sun is bright, but the clouds are black, you know? And when I see that now, you know what I mean? I know exactly where I am. I'm outside with my friends or listening to, we had this brother named Cowboy in my neighborhood. He went to Leavenworth, and he told us a story, which is the reason why we try to jump in a tornado. He always tells the story that the brothers at Leavenworth, when there was a tornado, the tornado would touch down in the yard, and all the brothers would try to jump in that thing and see if it would get them out to prison. And that's kind of how all those moments were so cinematic, and they had light stories to them. And so it's such a good question, because that's really the crux of, like, honestly, why I know we all do what we do is because we're trying to capture some smell, or like, I remember Rakim talking about being in his father's car, and he said he was a DJ in his wife's party, and he put a song on, and instantly he was in his father's car, and he could smell the thing, the little tree hanging from the rearview mirror. It's that thing that cinema does that is so, reminds me so much of like my childhood. And those are the things that you want to give to your kids now. You want it to be cinematic for them. You want it to be sensoramic, the smells and the taste and the uncomfortable thing. Like my grandparents' house in Louisville, because of what they had and what they were about, it just always smelled like eucalyptus. It just had that eucalyptus smell. It was very crisp, and the air was always just like sharp and very crisp. But in Chicago, the air was just thick, and it just was like, it was hostile to my senses in a different way, but I loved it. It was very warm. It always had a certain smell, certain resonance. There was something in the air, and the lighting was thicker, and it was just those things I would try to express in my work, you know, because I know my feeling to those moments are really honest, and that and I think those are universal moments for people, and if you give them that and the way something looks, then you're doing what we want. It's like you want audience to have euphoria. You want to see the film because you rarely get euphoria when you're making the film. You get that euphoric experience when you sit down in the theater and you see all the elements together. That's when the spiritual, cosmic experience is with film.
Thing that came to my mind, it's not a great impact, but it was D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. That had, which the black characters in it were all white with, you know, playing in blackface, but it changed, turned the tide in the United States, and after it, the Ku Klux Klan increased by 1,000-fold. The Griffith's film played in the White House, and at the time the president said it was like it was best film ever made. That it was like a lightning in a history book. So it was like it was a terrible result from the screening of this film, but it turned the tide for many years for racism and abuse and lynchings, just based upon that one film. And what was the second part of the?
How do you measure the impact of your own work?
Oh. Well, how do I measure the impact of my own work? Well, I would hope that my work inspires others and that they are seeing some of the same, the visual rhetoric that I'm using. I'm hoping that they're seeing the same thing and feeling the same things that I intended when I made it, when I thought of it. And I was just thinking about you talking about the euphoria when you see it on the screen. Actually, I get that euphoria when I'm writing it. And sometimes I'm writing and I find myself weeping. And then that's when I sense, that's when I know that it's going well for the story that I'm trying to tell.
Well, it's strange. I mean, there were certain films would really impress me, and we mentioned Saji Ray, The World of Apu. I was really moved. That's one, but there's a lot of films I've been moved by from all over the world, you know. And at the time at UCLA, and also that earlier, they had these movie of the week kind of things in LA that showed really terrific films, you know, and I was always, you know, they're very mature films. And so I grew up on those kinds of films, and not this crazy stuff you see on, well, it may not be crazy for a lot of people, but for me, it doesn't make any sense to me. Anyway, but I knew that those are the kind of things I wanted to talk about. I mean, to express and the films I wanted to do. But you know, when I made my films, I knew that I wanted people to think about them, like the content, but I didn't know that it would have happened, that it did happen, until people came up individually and says, you know, your film made me get into filmmaking. Your film had this effect on me, a very positive effect of things. So I got in a sort of a trickle-down way the effect of the work I've done. And so I think in many ways that's what sort of pushed me on to say, well, you know, you do have an audience out there, and it has made a difference. Like if you made a huge difference in someone's life, that's such a phenomenal thing to do, you know, to change someone's habits and make them feel as though that they're part of the human race and that sort of thing, you know, that you've accomplished something. You just weren't in the world and not having an effect on anyone, but you had a positive effect, you know. And so I think that's part of the thing that keeps me fighting for the kind of stories I want to tell, is I know that they can have a positive effect, and they do, sometimes.
Well, the film that really like changed everything for me, really honestly, is Daughters of the Dust. Like that really was very different for me. That was like, you know, before then it was just, I only knew of like Spike and John, you know, and those are the two black filmmakers that I knew of, that even existed, you know. I just had no gauge on that people of color made films, you know what I mean? I didn't understand that, you know. And those films have a very satisfactory, they're special in their own right, but they do satisfy, they check a box, you know what I mean? So if you're a person who's used to watching a certain kind of film, they check a box for you, even though they have a subversive layer of, you know, I always focus on Bill Lee, just really makes things go other places to me. I don't know what about his score, his sound made Spike's films really powerful for me. But I mean, honestly, seeing Daughters of the Dust just turned everything upside down for me, because the timing was different, you know. The attention to detail was just different. It made me sit still, you know what I mean? I didn't have to do that before. It made me have to engage with certain parts of my brain that films before just didn't require me to do that. And so that was like groundbreaking, but then also kind of it was sad, because I realized, like, man, what have I been watching? Like, what have I been seeing? Like, how do I feel about myself? How do I feel about the people I love the most? It just really, and I spoke earlier, just like, you know, reading the book, the making of the film, just like, it just, I don't know, just affirmed that. I felt like I knew the people making the film. Like, oh, those are family members. Those are some people that I really know. You know, they weren't just like people on the red carpet getting Oscars. It was like, oh, that's got a tenor and a vibe to it that's similar to the way my grandmother in Chicago would tell me stories, and that meant a lot. I would say also equally, equally, Killer Sheep and Ashes and Embers really rocked my world. Like, they did a lot for me in that way. My work, like, I don't know, I haven't thought about it. I don't even think about it. Like, I don't know. Yeah, I haven't, I guess, yeah, there's something. I remember one time Common said something to me, said, yeah, I do this for the aunties and the uncles. I was like, that's interesting. I think that's Selma did that. Selma did that for me. You know what I mean? My family didn't know what the hell I was doing until Selma came out. They still thought, this is my nephew here, producer. He a director of producing. Nah, I'm a cameraman. You know, I don't know what that is, but he produced movies. And so Selma was like the first time that, you know, my aunt who was in Selma came, and, you know, I think that film And so I don't look at any of my films after I finish them, so it's really difficult for me to think about it, because I struggle. I see a lot of things that don't work on my end, so I don't really deal with movies that I've shot after I've shot them. But yeah, that changed the game. That's like my big break as far as I'm concerned. Like, you know, my family actually saw the film and they went together and they organized themselves, and I was like, oh, that's what we did when we went to see School Days. So that's the equivalent. I made that film. You know what I mean? Like, busloads went, and that's cool. You know. So yeah.
Thank you.
Charles Burnett, Bradford Young, Julie Dash.